tell me how and why you got into thinking about relational metaphysics.
Well, it was interesting. Primarily, the motivation is the problem that arises epistemologically after Descartes. Um, how we can know anything, how we can get outside of our own head, how we can know anything external to ourselves. And I started thinking about that, and that's a problem that my friends have been wrestling with, and I've wrestled with, because if you're going to be a philosopher, you care about truth, and being able to know something's kind of important. And so that it's a problem is a problem. And so I started thinking about it, and I don't know how it came to me. I don't remember, but somehow it came to me that maybe we're thinking about being wrong. Since Aristotle, primarily, we think about it in terms of substance existing independently, substances at which nothing can be predicated upon. So, and I started thinking, well, that could cause problems, because if everything that's real is radically isolated, because there's no ontological way to connect it, well, how do you get from one to the other? It seems kind of impossible. But maybe we should think about relation differently. Being differently, and think of it in terms of relation. And when I started thinking about it, it made sense. Because to talk about something as independent doesn't really make sense, because that's already a relational term. To be independent means there's some other that it's independent of. So we can't really talk about something about being independent without an underlying relational field, or it's kind of what Heidegger calls it, referential frame, or whatever, field, referential relations, I think is what he calls it. So without that underlying, we can't really get from one to the other. And so that's kind of what prodded the idea.
Yeah, you mentioned that Descartes and maybe a lot of modern philosophy has taken a more substance route. I mean, is that would you say that is a kind of materialism? Is what term? Because that's the term I'm more familiar with, and so because I'm then interested in, tell me more about substance, metaphysics, materialism, and what that. Because that's kind of the frame and basis from which you're kind of going, wait, but does this work? And is there something different to think about philosophy in the world?
Well, I don't think it's just modern philosophers. And of course, Nietzsche points out that the project completely collapses, and so we get postmodernism. I think my own view is that it really does go back significantly to Aristotle, and it comes down to us through the scholastics, and Descartes is somewhat responding to the scholastics. But Aquinas and the scholastics understood God in these terms too, as one simple, and if it's simple, that means it's independent, and they call it substance. The second part, I dealt with this a little bit in the first part of the book, but I've got a second book coming out called Substance Ontology and the Crisis of Reason, which is really the other side of the question, and deals more with substance ontology and its collapse. But I think it goes all the way back. I argue it goes back to Parmenides, and that there are competing ontological understandings back in the pre-Socratics with, now I can't remember, Anaximander, I believe. I get him and Anaximenes all mixed up all the time. I think it's Anaximander. And Heraclitus take a more relational approach. Parmenides is more substance. And then it kind of splits off in Plato and comes down to us through Aristotle and the Neoplatonists. The Neoplatonists taking the relational approach. But, Neoplatonism kind of becomes overshadowed. So it kind of disappears. And I think, does it entail materialism? I don't know that it does. I think perhaps it's easy to become a materialist to a certain degree, because one of the problems with a subject-oriented approach to knowledge, where knowledge is something that's acquired through the activity and through the capabilities of a subject, as opposed to something that's, well, I argue in one of my papers published, that's given to us from being itself. Or as Aristotle said, knowledge is this union of the knower and the known. The mind becomes what it knows, and on the soul, which I found really bizarre when I first read that. But if knowledge is the result of my own attempts to know, then it's easy to see that my sense experience becomes the primary source of knowledge. And when it gets down to senses, I can see where, that would end up being a materialistic approach. But materialism has its own problems, because the idea of material still entails something outside my mind. And how do I know anything about matter? I have a friend who's Berkeleyan, and that's precisely why he's Berkeleyan, is because he says, well, I don't know what this matter thing is. What are you talking about when you talk about matter? So it's all ideas. So it all has to be ideas.
So would you say, yeah, materialism probably is a kind of substance metaphysics, but thinking about substance is broader, maybe?
Yeah, I don't think substance necessarily entails that. I think it entails solipsism. I mean, that's, I think, Kant with the transcendental ego, and Husserl with his transcendental ego, and Husserl even kind of calls his view of solipsism that's not really solipsism, because you have to have these other egos, but there's really the only basis for knowing these other egos is through my own ego. So I still think it reduces to solipsism. And I don't know about materialism. That's an interesting question. I do think there are problems with the idea of matter, if you're going to say matter is anything other than an idea in my mind.
Right. So it's then comes to a kind of, as you say, a fundamental kind of question going really far back as to the relationship between the one and the many, right? We're not making any assumptions even about idealism, materialism, but how does if for example, then you point to people like Aquinas, they have a substance metaphysics, but it's like, if that's some some isolated thing, the world is some isolated thing, how does that lead to all the variation that we see in the world? And is it and then how does that variation go back to the one? If it's like there are these isolated objects, and then how do they interact? And
well, that's why Neoplatonism, I think, has the key, because it's all a manifestation of the one, which isn't really one. I mean, even Plotinus says, well, we call it one, but it's not really one. That's why Neoplatonism, I think, is a better alternative, because it is all already connected.
So would you say Neoplatonism kind of doesn't get into this problem from the start, because in the one it's really actually many anyway, and it's, you can call it one, but there's some kind of unity amongst the many that's presupposed?
Yeah, I mean, you can't really say the one is many. That's a problem.
Okay.
But the one is, and I think this is key, it's indefinite. It's neither one nor many. It is indefinite, because both one, and this is the problem of the dialogue, Parmenides, Plato's dialogue. If it's one, well, then we've got problems with being. If it's many, then we got problems with being. So it can't be one or many. And so where does that leave us? And of course, in the dialogue, we're just kind of left with, well, this is a mess.
This is a mess, and that's not a great place to leave you. But so, and that makes me think. So, tell me more about relational metaphysics, and because you said there's some intermediary. There's neither one nor many, but some indefinite. And could that indefiniteness be to do with relations itself, not things relating, but something like relational metaphysics at the bottom?
Well, yeah, and that's where I think some relational or process metaphysician might disagree with me, but when I was reading the process and other people who deal with relation, they're still caught up in the Aristotelian, what I call the Aristotelian understanding of relation. The Greek is prosti, toward something. Aristotle says in the categories, relation is prosti, toward something. We call that relation which relates, to things. So it's grounded on the relata, grounded on the things that it relates. But it can't be that because, like I pointed out earlier, to be independent of something else already entails a fundamental relationality. So, yeah, I think there is the relation, pure relation, what I call pure relation, which is indefinite. The pure relation has to be ontologically prior to any relata or definite beings. It has to be prior. The definite beings, the definite relata, have to arise out of this relational thing. How does that work? Well, ultimately, and I think if in the book I kind of bring this out, relation in order, it gets really complicated and paradoxical. Relation, in order to be relation, does have to have things it relates. I mean, it's not relation. So, but given that relation is ontologically prior to what it relates, it has to be these relata that are themselves pure relation. And, we've got that in history. That's precisely what the Trinity is. It's this difference that's not different. The three persons that are three, but they're not three. They're one. And I that's a significant section of the book is talking about the Trinity and how the Trinity really reflects this pure ontological relationality.
It's interesting because if you do make the case that relations are primary, yeah, it's that things have to be relating, but also, like, how do you get those things? Those you can also, like, keep going down levels and be like, well, they're also fundamentally the reason why. Like, I want to maybe even, like, if it makes sense to do this, to think about examples. Like, imagine you think about even like an atom. Like, you can say an atom, like, in chemistry is a thing, but then, like, the electrons and then the protons are all relating, and then you can look at, like, a proton, and we realize there's quarks and things inside that. So then it's like, it's hard to really separate the relation and the thing. And
that's the thing. Even scientists, it keeps going down. We say, oh no, the basic fundamental particle is an atom. Well, no, it's not. You get protons, neutrons, and electrons. Well, those are the basic parts. Well, no, they're not. You get quarks and muons, whatever, and these other things. And then you keep breaking them apart. And I mean, it's interesting because none of it ends up being material in the end. It's all energy. So.
Right. I mean, tell me maybe more about this example of thinking about the Trinity as something which is relational, especially because, again, it's kind of hard to think of what's a good way to explain this, but it's, it's interesting. When do we start conceptualizing of the Trinity in this way? It's it's so important, Western and Christian culture, and kind of a bit confusing as well. So, what kind of is it telling us, and, like, how does it work?
Well, if I could do that.
Go on. This is an easy question.
Was it St. Gregory said, whoever tries to delve into the nature of the Trinity is driving himself to madness, or something like that. Well, the interesting thing I find is that you don't really have to be Christian to grasp this idea. Plotinus has a Trinity. You got the one being intelligence. The first emanation from the one is being and intelligence. So you get many at the first level, but at some level, yeah, being and intelligence is an emanation in the lower level of the one, but then this is, he talks about it as it's the one looking at itself, which is being, and so it's kind of not. And of course, then you get being, intelligence, and the soul, which you can kind of see as a trinity. And the idea of, I took a class on medieval Neoplatonists. We talked about Kusa and Eckhart in the class, and the teacher asked one day, came up when we were talking about Kusa, and she asked one day, what's the first plurality? And it's not two. We think that, the first plural is two. It's not two. Because if you got one thing and another thing, and that's all you've got, and nothing to relate them, well, you don't have two. It's a third thing is required in order to relate the one and the two, so that they're even a one and a two. It kind of goes back to what I was saying about you can't be independent without being related already. So there's already this threeness that exists in reality. Plotinus did it, and he's recognized it. He's not Christian. And it just kind of, it makes perfect sense. As far as the Trinity itself goes, you can't talk about the Father if there's no Son, and you can't talk about the Son if there's no Father. To be a Son entails that there's a Father. Now the Spirit is kind of harder because it seems like maybe Spirit could be Spirit without the Father or the Son. That's a little trickier, but I think it works. And there's some traditions that see the Spirit as the love between the Father and the Son. I've seen that. I think it's Augustine maybe talks about it in those terms. But yeah, there's.
And
there's
that
some...
would and
Go
that would
ahead.
be interesting, because I guess if they're father and son, I mean, there's like no love between them, and there isn't something mediating them. It's also a bit like what then? It's also neither father nor son. It's and then it's interesting just to help me understand it. So when you talk about like saying something is independent of something, kind of supposes that they can be compared, like it's independent from something, right? And yeah,
Right.
yeah. There's something.
You can't be independent all by yourself. Yeah.
Which is such a funny thing to say, but yeah, it makes sense in the way we're framing and thinking about these concepts. Well, it's interesting you bring up Plotinus and how, so it's not even just the Trinity. Other people have thought about these relations, grounding reality. What are the modern philosophers that take up these views? You talked about Descartes and maybe Kant as well, presupposing a kind of substance metaphysics. What does it look like in the modern day?
I do think, and this is what I argue in the book and in my dissertation, I do think Heidegger is recovering it in Being in Time and in his other later work. It's been extensive discussion making that argument. But I don't think he recognizes what he's discovering. He kind of sees it and it and tries to talk about it, but it isn't explicit because I don't think he knows. There's a story about Heidegger that I included in the dissertation. I think it's in the book, where he was reading this Eastern philosopher. I think it's Suzuki. And he got all excited and he told his friend one day, he said, "This guy's saying what I've been trying to say my entire career." So he was attracted to Eastern philosophy, and I think the Eastern understanding of reality is at least closer, if not identical to what I'm trying to. I mean, I'm not familiar enough with Eastern philosophy to commit to saying, "Oh yeah, this is exactly what I'm saying." But I think Eastern philosophy lacks the dualism that we have in the West. However that manifests itself, I'm not completely sure, not being as familiar as I would like to be. But yeah, and I think that's what Heidegger was recognizing. That's what attracted Heidegger to the Eastern philosophers, I think, was recognizing that metaphysical.
Interesting that the Heidegger himself was actually kind of influenced by those people. I mean, would you say that Heidegger was kind of radical in his in his time, or just in general, in going against the philosophers around him? How important is he, or will he be, do you think?
Well, he's I mean, he's critically important. He influenced Levinas. He influenced a whole bunch of people that came after him. Uh, Ironically enough, given his ties to Nazi, and Levinas was Jewish, that he was so influenced by Heidegger, and the controversy over Heidegger's views on the Jews. So yeah, Heidegger's interesting. He presents a lot of problems. He never talks about ethics that I can think of, and given that he was in the middle of probably one of the most horrific evils, not to talk about ethics is kind of interesting. So I don't know what it means, but yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say as well that he poses a lot of questions, and they're not necessarily all resolved either, right? And
Right.
it's helpful though, and actually a challenge and something to be lauded that someone can kind of pose the right questions, right? Because a lot of the time we're kind of asking the wrong questions, or we frame something wrong. I guess that's something that Heidegger is really good at doing, is kind of questioning the assumptions for the kinds of questions that we're actually asking.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's important about him is he deconstructs the way we're viewing. Uh, Maybe that's not the right word, but yeah, he gets us to look at it differently than the way we have been.
What do you think is the importance in culture and civilization in thinking about relational versus substance metaphysics? Do these questions matter for the way we live our lives?
I think, well, boy, you're going to get me in trouble and open up a can of worms. Yeah, I mean, just look at. Okay, well, let me start with a movie that I don't know. It's on Netflix. Netflix produced it, and you can't really get it outside of Netflix. So maybe that's why. It's called The Social Dilemma. Have you ever seen it?
I
Uh,
Sounds familiar. I don't think I have though.
it got the premise of the movie. It's a documentary. Is the problems that social media is causing us with the algorithms? Because all this, people who create social media, they don't care what position you take. They want you clicking on their site. So they develop these algorithms that determine and predict what you're interested in, and then they just keep feeding you what you're interested in over and over and over again. It kind of becomes an echo chamber. And they argue in the movie that this is feeding a lot of the problems we're having with polarization, uh, ideological polarization. And it's interesting because it's actually later in the documentary. Roger McNamara, I think, is one guy's name, and Tristan Harris are the two people. Roger McNamara, if I'm getting the name right, is an investment banker. And he said the fundamental problem is we have no common reality from which to to come at each other. And so, if each person has their own reality, then we have no basis for dialogue. Tristan Harris says the same thing, but he says a little different. He says the fundamental problem beyond all other problems is that we have no common truth. We have no understanding of truth. And I think that's exactly right. And you see it. I can see it in my students. They come into my class and they don't care about understanding anybody else's perspective. All perspectives are equal, so mine's just as valid as yours. Yours doesn't matter, and you can't prove yours. So, then nobody seeks to understand truth.
Instead, yeah.
And so we end up yelling at each other, and we just get further and further apart. And we don't even value listening to the other side. Uh, you probably don't know much I'm assuming you don't know much about American politics, but back when Biden was running against Trump the first time, or I guess the only time since he's not running against Trump anymore. Um, but one of the things he touted at the beginning was his ability to work with people on all sides of the spectrum. He had worked with, uh, in the 50s and 60s, he'd worked with, I think it's 50s and 60s. Somebody's going to correct me and say, oh, you're stupid. You don't remember, you get your dates wrong. But back in, you had some Southern congressmen that were still pretty racist back in the 50s. And he was telling, I was able to work with these people and get stuff done. And he caught horrible criticism for that. He's like, you shouldn't be working with these people. They're evil and they're racist. Don't work with them. I'm like, okay, they've got evil ideas, but you have to work with people. You have to listen to people. You can't just.
Because the alternative is kind of like closing them off and pushing them away. But like, if ultimately there's some important sense in which we're actually all connected, and the different perspectives that we have are not isolated and just interchangeable, but actually are constituting and sort of creating, affording one another. So the different, so it's like, from your perspective, you can disagree, and maybe rightly so, with like, other people's stances, but it's so easy to kind of go, how dare you, we should completely exclude this, but that's kind of not a very complex or helpful way of thinking about issues.
It's not a very John Stuart Mill talks about this in his I think it's on liberty, maybe it's utilitarianism, I think it's on liberty, the freedom of speech, freedom of thought, how we have to have radical, and he advocated radical freedom of speech and freedom of thought, except in very, very, unless it causes harm, which is problematic. How do you define harm? But he's like, basically, it should never be, as long as it's just speech, it should never be disallowed. Because if we, and it's like, there's two possibilities. I've got an idea. I've got idea A. My idea A is either true or it's false. If it's false, well, if I stop the other person from talking, well, then I'm never going to be able to learn that it's false, and I'm never going to be able to learn the truth. But even if it's true, if I stop the other person from talking, then it becomes a dead dogma that I don't really know why I believe anymore, and it just becomes kind of a dead thought in your head that has no real meaning.
And yeah, it makes me think about what you were saying earlier about, to be independent from something kind of needs that opponent processing, needs that other side to kind of go, oh wait, actually, otherwise it's like, kind of, as you say, kind of dead. It's isolated, and therefore, what is it even trying to say? It's like, even meaning itself feels like it's kind of in contrast and reflection against something else.
Yeah. Yeah, like I said, independence is nothing. To be independent is to be nothing. But that's very Neoplatonic.
Yeah. We talked about Plotinus, and so he's the way I'm understanding it, he's not a theist. He doesn't believe in God, but there's relational thinking in his work. I mean, do you think relational metaphysics requires a God, or is it improved by it? And again, another easy question. What is the relationship between God and relational metaphysics?
Yeah, I would probably disagree a little bit that Plotinus didn't have a God, because I think he even calls the one God. Now, it's not the Christian God. It's not. You can argue whether it's a personal God or not, but if you understand, and this is what I argue in my class, we all have a concept of God. If we understand God as the supreme being, because whatever is the source of being is God. Now, it may not be personal, may not be triune, but there is a concept of God. And yeah, I do think, well, and on that, I would argue that, and I think this is one of the things I hope I succeeded at in my book, this relational ontology requires the Trinity. And I'm going to, This is something I thought about a while back. If the source of being isn't conscious, then where does consciousness come from? Uh, I know there are people that say, well, it just, what is the word? Emanationist or emanational? There's a scientific idea now that things just arise. They're greater than the sum of their parts, but you get all these parts together and somehow something extra just arises out of the combination. I think that doesn't make much sense. Uh, so I think the source, it has to be in the source, or it can't be in the effect. It can't be in, but Descartes says that. It's one of the things I do agree with on Descartes. There can't be anything in the effect that doesn't exist in the cause prior to the effect.
And so do you think thinking about a God is helpful because there can be a kind of consciousness or at least a perspective, but at the foundation?
Well, if nothing else, and being an Orthodox Christian, I do think there's a lot more to it. But if on no other ground, the idea of a God should get us out of ourselves, and it should humble us so that we don't become solipsist. We don't overvalue our own perspectives and opinions. We do have some humility and recognize that, I may be wrong, maybe even I'm probably wrong. Because if you don't admit you're wrong, if you're not willing to admit you're wrong, then you'll never learn. As long as you
Right.
keep thinking, oh, I got it all down, well, no, you're never going to learn anything.
Well, and it's at the very least you're thinking about relational metaphysics really adds something, and even if we definitely still want to be talking with people. No, I think, oh, I don't know. I think substance metaphysics still makes a lot of sense, but can we get dialogue? And that makes me kind of want to then ask. I mean, what is your future going to look like in this kind of work? You mentioned a book more about substance metaphysics.
Well, maybe I shouldn't say this. The original dissertation, when I wrote it, when I first finished it, when I completed it all, had it all written down, was 220,000 words. My dissertation director, the Welsh guy, great friend, love him, we talk a lot. He looked at it and said, no. He said, this has to get down. And I was like, well, we knew it was going to be big when I started. And he said, yeah, but not that big. I was thinking about 100,000 words, not 220. And so we ended up, I put that aside and said, okay, well, this is the whole dissertation. I'll reduce it for the committee and for the degree. And so I did. I cut it down to, I think, about 170,000 words. And they were happy with that. Or maybe not happy, but they took it.
Allow it, yeah.
Yeah. And then I thought, stupidly, I thought, well, I'll keep the big 220,000. I'll take it to publishers and try and get it published. And, because they won't care that it's too long. They don't. Well, that was stupid because, yeah, they do. I had to cut it down even further to get it published. So I went from 170,000 to 120,000, which left me a big chunk that wasn't published in the first book, sitting to the side. And that's essentially what the second book is the stuff that I cut out for the first book.
It's fascinating that it all came kind of back when you were writing your dissertation and grasping at the deep questions of like, how do we get knowledge about the world at all? How does any of this even work? And you're kind of like, I have to read Heidegger. This is going to be a challenge, and that's part of where it comes from, and the kind of intuition as well.
Yeah. Intuition, yeah. We've kind of corrupted that word. In Latin, it means to see something. But now, when we talk about intuition, we kind of mean just a feeling, something else. And I think, and this may be worth getting into, I think one of the problems that arose from Descartes and after Descartes is the way we understand reason. And I think this is the critical problem with modern or Enlightenment thought. Historically, there are two types of reasoning. There's discursive reasoning and there's non-discursive reasoning. I generally have to explain the difference between my students, so I'll just do it here. I mean, you might understand it, but maybe people who would be listening won't. Discursive comes from the word discourse, and discursive reasoning operates through a process, step by step. There's two types, deductive and inductive, and there are other types, but they generally can be reduced to one of the two, generally inductive. But you start with a premise, you have a second premise, and then you draw a conclusion. That's both deduction and induction. Okay, some epistemologist was going to, no, you're wrong, but that's the way I see it. The difference is, in a deductive syllogism, if you've done it right, and if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to follow. It can't be false. Must be true, however you want to say it. In an inductive syllogism, even if the premises are true, the conclusion isn't necessarily true, it's probably true. Induction is like, well, it rained every month for the past 52 months. It's going to rain this month too. Well, that's an inductive kind of reasoning. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's deductive. If the premises are true, well, then the conclusion just has to be true. The problem with both of those is they rely on a premise that can't be gotten through discursive reasoning. If I take my deductive syllogism, the truth of the conclusion depends on the truth of the premise. Well, how do I know the truth of the premise? I can go back to a prior deductive argument, but then that's going to rely on the truths of that premise. Somewhere I have to have these first principles. That's what the ancients call them, first principles, that are basically self-evident. Now, this non-discursive reasoning doesn't work that way. It's what I call, what I think Plato called, I think you see this in the Republic, especially, and in the cave analogy, somewhat particularly. He calls it a seeing. You look at something and you see it and you recognize it. This is the way we know the forms in objects for Plato. I look at the canon because I have this already have this idea of the form, idea of form, same word in Greek. I have the idea of the canon in my head, the form of the canon in my head. I recognize it when I see it in the can, and it's this immediate recognition that's non-discursive. And I think that's what, prior to Enlightenment, thought people meant by intuition. You see something, you recognize it as true, and yeah, you just say, oh yeah, of course that's true. One of the easiest examples of this is the principle of non-contradiction. Something can't be and not be at the same time in the same way. Well, that's not the conclusion of a deduction or an induction. You just think about it and like, well, yeah, that's just true. It can't not be true. It's just true. I don't see it and experience it and see it. And if somebody's going to deny it, and I've had students come up to me and say, I don't believe in the principle of non-contradiction. And I'm saying, well, then we can't have a conversation. We can't talk. If you're going to tell me that truth is false and false is true and, nothing means anything, we can't talk. So, yeah.
I like your students really making sure you earn, it's a force to kind of think for everything. And I it's interesting you bring up that intuition is something thought of as kind of, it's emotional and it's a kind of like could be true or could not be. And no doubt, kind of as you kind of say, I mean, there can be false intuitions, but again, can we really do anything without some kind of intuitive reasoning that helps us see and understand and connect to reality in the first place, right? For example, how do you where is the place from which you start doing deductive reasoning
Yeah.
anyway? And go on.
Oh, that's okay. I think one of the reasons non-discursive reasoning has disappeared is because you can't have it without this fundamental relation, because it's an immediate contact with between the knower and the known. It's an immediate connection between the thing that knows and the thing that's known, and substance ontology not allowing that has to come up with other ways. So we have to reason our way through a process to get out of our heads to something outside. We have to make an argument that there's something outside of our mind. We can't just have a connection to it. We have to make an argument for it.
This also reminds me of Whitehead and his prehension, and almost like it's not like an entity understanding something, but like a connection between. I even heard that the word experience itself, we think of experience as a kind of a mental thing, and we experience something from our perspective. But experience, I forgot what it means, but it's like, it just means like to connect. It's like kind of, it's connect, and so, and you could think about like when I see something, the light rays are like literally hitting. We're connected in a way. We just don't think about. We kind of in our minds think about a separation between the seer and the seen, but there's light, there's gravity, there's all these different things, so everything is really connected anyway. And
you see the three there again. It comes out in the sun analogy. You got the eye, you got the object of sight, but without the light of the sun mediating the two, there's no vision happening. Let's see.